Coping with sanctions has become a daily reality for many ship owners and operators. Hi, this is Marcus Hand, editor of Seatrade Maritime News. And in this latest episode of the Seatrade Maritime Podcast, we are in conversation with Mike Salthouse, Head of External Affairs for P&I Club NorthStandard. You will learn more about the impact of the latest round of UK sanctions, the step up in enforcement against dark fleet vessels in Europe, as well as the risk situation in the Red Sea following the recent US and Houthi ceasefire. Welcome to the podcast, Mike.
Thank you.
We've been seeing an increasingly complex sanction environment evolve over the last few years. How much has this impacted owners and operators?
I think it's had a significant impact on owners and operators. Sanctions amount to micromanagement of trade by states. In other words, the trades that they can do, the ports they can call at, the cargoes they can carry. And even when certain cargoes are permitted, for example, oil under the Russian oil price cap, that whole trade is micromanaged. And there's a number of sort of consequences from a sanctions program, such as the Russian oil price cap. For example, there's a longer sea passage. They can carry the oil, but only if and get insurance for it, but only if it's below price cap. And that's just one example. There's obviously pretty much every piece of trade into the highly sanctioned countries, such as Iran or Russia, is subject to some form of restriction, whether it's agri-products, coals, metals, dual use. They're all affected by sanctions. So there's a hugely complex regulatory environment grown up. The consequences of getting it wrong are absolutely catastrophic. So there's an awful lot of investment had to go into managing and understanding those risks. So it's created this rather toxic combination of cost, reward, complexity, and uncertainty, all of which I think sometimes is quite attractive to a ship owner because shipping is about taking risk. The second area where it's had a big impact is given rise to a fleet of vessels that are structured to trade cargoes that are sanctioned by the West. And this is actually quite a big fleet now. We still don't have an agreed definition. Lloyd's List will define it one way. UARNI in the United States will define it another way. The IMO has a definition. But when you understand that Clarkson's at the beginning of this year was saying there's probably about 1,200 vessels subjected to some form of sanction now, and that's probably increased by another 200 since then. We're looking at quite a significant fleet. And the problem here is that these vessels are older and they won't be insured, classed, or within the EU G7 group of nations. They exist to serve as a particular trade. So there's no real customer safety oversight that you might get from an oil major. So we've now got this secondary fleet that's grown up, and that's the sort of secondary consequence of sanctions.
Now, that secondary fleet is something I think I've seen you refer to as the parallel fleet.
Yeah.
Unlike a lot of people who call it the dark or the shadow fleet. Is there a particular reason you call it the parallel fleet? And perhaps you explain?
Well, I think people like journalists, forgive me, like calling it the dark fleet or the shadow fleet because that suggests some sort of untoward behaviour, and that sells newspapers because it's something ugly and unpleasant. But I think that's ignoring the fact that shipping is a market-driven economy, and when you get a unilateral sanctions program, in other words, a sanctions program that's introduced by a few states, as opposed to a multilateral sanctions program, which affects all states under the UN, then those states that are not part of the sanctioning authority, there's no reason why they can't carry those particular cargoes. Countries like, for example, India or China or Russia, which are not members of the EU G7, they're not subject to those sanctions programs. So the obvious way in which they move their cargoes outside the reach of sanctions is by getting vessels which operate in a parallel commercial dynamic, which means that they are flagged, insured, classed outside of the EU G7 group of nations. And that's why I prefer calling it a parallel fleet, because it's a response to a unilateral sanctions program, and it's running in parallel with mainline shipping, simply accessing services from jurisdictions that are not affected by unilateral sanctions programs.
If you're enjoying the Seatrade Maritime Podcast, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on the app of your choice. Now, we've seen in the last few weeks, recent UK additions to sanctions against Russia. So what do owners and operators need to know about that?
Well, I think both the European Union, the United States at the start of the year, just before the Trump administration took over, EU and UK have all increased the number of vessels that have been designated. From a UK perspective, quite significantly. The reason they will designate these ships is because they are likely to have been identified as being involved in breaking sanctions. What does that mean for everybody else? Well, it means that when you're doing your due diligence, you need to be particularly careful to avoid those ships for two reasons. First of all, because they have been identified as high-risk vessels engaged in sanctions breaking. And secondly, because that is the expectation of sanctions programs and the due diligence guidance that states actually publish. What does that mean? Well, it means that if you are ordered to do an STS with a vessel that may not be designated, but has had an engagement with that vessel prior, so in other words, maybe there's been an STS to the ship from which you are now being asked to STS, you'll be expected to spot that and question whether those orders are valid or not. The other effect, obviously, is that UK financial services, UK maritime professional services can't provide those services to those vessels because it would be a breach of sanctions. And that goes back to your earlier point. It pushes those vessels outside of sort of mainstream financing, mainstream insurance, mainstream legal systems into what we would probably term the parallel fleet, so that they're operating outside the accepted norms of merchant shipping.
Now, that's also going to put, it's not only a risk to the owner-operator, is it? It's also yourselves as a club there, because you've mentioned the financial part. So how do you sort of work with your clients to sort of manage all of that risk?
There are two aspects to that. First of all, there is our own risk. So every time there is vessels are designated, we run through that list to make sure that we're not currently insuring them. If they were, that insurance would come to an end automatically caused by the designation. It does happen, but that's quite rare these days for a vessel that's been designated to be part of either ourselves or international group clubs. And then secondly, we need really to make sure that in the advice that we're giving to members that we're aware of these vessels and highlighting to members the risks of engaging with them, which, as I said, it may not be a direct engagement, but maybe there's an STS chain where one of these vessels has been involved. And states have perhaps unrealistic expectations that you will track back that STS chain and identify that vessel being part of it, and therefore a higher likelihood that the cargo is in breach of sanctions. So staying on top of all these legislative changes is a big part of what we do. It's a big part of the service that we and other P&I clubs provide to their members.
Okay. You mentioned talking about parallel fleet, and it seems to be operating in many senses almost with impunity, just as you say, in parallel. But we are seeing sort of a harder line from European nations now on ships sort of trading through the Baltic. Is this going to make a difference?
I think there's a number of issues there. There is the ability of a vessel to trade is not dependent on it having Western financial services and regulated in a jurisdiction which is subject to EU G7 sanctions. So it's quite difficult for vessels to be prevented from trading. The Europeans, I think, and various other nations are wrestling with this because the laws that govern the right of innocent passage and the right to prevent vessels from disturbing undersea cables and subsea infrastructure were sort of designed to really, quite a significant time ago. And in the case of the undersea cables, it was actually in the 19th century. So our law is out of date and they don't really have the ability to sort of intervene in perhaps the way they would actually like. In terms of enforcement, the steps taken by the European Union, well, that enforcement is left with the member state. And whilst they have worked hard to draw up a unified code or unified directive setting out what the punishments are for breach of sanctions, I think it's fair to say we haven't seen a huge amount of enforcement action carried out by the individual member states. That may well be coming. If you're looking at the United States or the UK, you'll see activities which they are now reaching a conclusion about and administering penalties for probably took place 2 or 3 years ago. So it may well be that we might start to see some enforcement action within the European Union against states within their jurisdiction over the course of the next few months.
If this is enforced and you do see more enforcement, how much difference will it make?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And that goes to the sort of slightly different standards. If you're a financial services company, then adherence to the law is non-negotiable. You don't take risk. As far as possible, you're managing out that risk of breaking sanctions. If you have an inadvertent slip, even if the authorities haven't identified it, you're expected to sort of notify your regulators about it. So that creates a particular environment. If you're shipping and you're not being punished, shipping is a risk-taking activity. There are some sections of the shipping community that will probably take that risk if they don't feel that there is a serious risk of being punished if they get it wrong.
Yeah, as you said earlier, some ship owners like risks because you make money for it.
It's a risk-based business, and we should celebrate that because at its best, it's a very good thing. But ultimately, sanctions work best when there is a rigorous and transparent enforcement mechanism.
Yeah, understood. And then looking to Iran, there's been under Trump this sort of stance of maximum pressure. Is that changing much with that?
Yeah, I think it is in the sense that we've been here before. We've seen a maximum pressure campaign before. I think some facts. If you start and look at the end of the last Trump administration, Iranian oil exports were down to about 300,000 barrels per day. Today, they're about 1.4 million barrels per day. And not all of that is going on parallel fleet shipping. Some of it is coming out on parallel fleet shipping or dark fleet, whatever you prefer, and then being STS'd perhaps through a series of STSs onto mainstream shipping. And that is a problem. It's a problem because the US has an appetite to use secondary sanctions. The consequences of being the subject of secondary sanctions designation are catastrophic. It will put you out of business, particularly if it's not listed. So if we accept that there is a focus on Iran, and we accept that the US has the tools to enforce and is prepared to use them, then I think there are very, very real risks to mainstream shipping inadvertently getting caught up on these smuggling operations simply because of the volume of oil that's currently coming out of Iran. And we just have to wait and see how that manifests itself. They've recently republished an advisory. They've said pretty much nothing about Russia since Trump took over, but they have published an updated advisory on US-Iranian sanctions, and it's probably very worthwhile. I'd recommend everybody in shipping reads that and understands exactly where the US is going.
And that sets out a more sort of stringent.
I think it does a very good job. I mean, sanctions it's a dynamic environment, and it updates their guidance from that which was last issued, I think, back in 2018. So it certainly gives guidance as to what the United States currently expects by way of due diligence if you're going to when you're engaging in the carriage of oil and other cargoes that might be subject to sanctions.
Okay, so kind of watch this space and see what happens with that whole relationship with the US and Iran.
Yeah.
Now, just before we started recording, we were talking about the phone call that Trump had with Putin about Ukraine. If sort of current conflicts are resolved, have sanctions just now become part of a daily reality of shipping, though? We're still going to have this, but just for other issues.
I think there's two aspects to the answer to that question. First of all, sanctions, once imposed, take a long time to remove. The only significant removal of sanctions that I can recall was following the conclusion of the JCPOA in 2016. Thereafter, Trump reimposed sanctions, and the Biden administration maintained those on Iran through the currency of the Biden administration. If the world changed overnight and the Russian-Ukraine war was concluded, it may be that sanctions or the withdrawal of certain sanctions are part of that overall deal. I don't see how they couldn't be, but we're not there yet. And I would just caution that it's a lot easier to impose sanctions than it is to remove them. And even once they're removed, there is also, if you like, secondary compliance where businesses like ours remain nervous about engaging with trade associated with a state that has, until very recently, been very heavily sanctioned, and there is still a period of uncertainty following the conclusion of whatever agreement has brought about the reduction in legal sanctions.
So there's kind of like a long tail effect to it.
I would say so, yes. But, let's wait and see. If a deal is done over Russia tomorrow, and part of that is that states formally have to withdraw sanctions, then we would look at the environment thereafter and work out what we can and can't do. But we're not there yet. And history suggests that it's quite difficult to reach that position.
Yeah. Moving away specifically from Ukraine, but if we just look at the broader environment, would you say that sanctions just seem to have become a sort of like kind of a weapon of choice in terms of governments and managing conflicts?
Yeah, I think after some recent conflicts, thinking about Afghanistan, thinking about Iraq, And thinking about the US and UK decision not to intervene in Syria, that there's been an increasing reluctance to use force, and sanctions have offered an alternative. They've become an integral part of certainly Western foreign policy. And why wouldn't they? You're looking at particularly in shipping, economic measures which affect 90% of world trade. So you can cause real economic harm to a nation which is not doing what you want it to do. So I think it's likely to remain a feature of shipping for the foreseeable future.
Okay, so something that people are going to have to keep on being aware about and keep abreast of as we go forward.
Absolutely.
Now, I'd just like to come to one other risk, which is the Red Sea. Now, we've seen the sort of ceasefire between the US and the Houthi. Is this going to be enough to bring people to start trading back through there who have redirected their vessels via the Cape of Good Hope, or what do we need to see?
Well, I think in due course, if there is a sustained period of a safe environment within the Red Sea, then ultimately charters will start to order vessels to transit through the Suez Canal rather than going around the Cape of Good Hope. I think there is inevitably a lag, and there is still a lot of uncertainty in the Red Sea. Why do I say that? Well, the United States has got a lot of military assets in Diego Garcia, an unprecedented level of assets in Diego Garcia. The view is that is there in support of, or in case negotiations with Iran between the United States and Iran currently do not produce some form of long-term agreement in relation to Iran's nuclear program. So I think most people in shipping would sit there and say, well, it's a lull. What's happened with the Houthis is a good thing. That reduces the risk to mainstream shipping going through the canal. But is it enough for us to start routing vessels back through the Suez when actually all our timetabling and the extra costs are now factored into the longer sea route? Maybe not just yet, but let's see what happens with the US-Iran discussions.
So you actually see this as being tied to US-Iran, not just the sort of conflict with Israel and Gaza?
I think it's a combination of inertia in the sense that everybody's used to going around the Cape of Good Hope at the moment.
Yeah.
It's a reflection of the fact that it's an extremely volatile area, and the reasons for that volatility have not gone away. We still have a significant war in the Middle East region. We still have Iran supporting Hamas, which is an enemy of the United States, an enemy of Israel. And there are ongoing discussions with Iran in relation to their nuclear program. So, it could erupt in a very short space of time. And I think most ship owners and charterers are probably very, very mindful of that. And that is not possibly enough yet to break the inertia associated with the fact that the current routing is well established around the Cape of Good Hope.
I mean, if as a club, if you were talking to an owner and they were considering this, what would you say to them?
Probably exactly what I've just said, which is that obviously the reduction in risk associated with the Houthis is a good thing, but the situation could change very much. And in any event, we would only be consulted where a charterer was ordering the vessel to go through the Red Sea, and the owner would be sitting there saying, well, can I refuse that order because it's unsafe? The answer is... it's for the longer there is no attacks against shipping going on, it becomes demonstrably more safe, and it becomes much more difficult for the ship owner to say, no, I want to go around the Cape of Good Hope, please.
Okay, so another situation where it is very much kind of wait and see then.
Wait and see, but developing. And I think the outcome of the discussions between Iran and the United States will probably determine whether the Suez Canal sort of returns to anything like full capacity.
Great. It's been really interesting talking to you today and getting your opinions for our listeners. And I'd love to come back and talk to you about these at a later date and see where it has progressed.
Yes, and I'll be proved wrong, I'm sure. Thank you very much, Marcus. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you for listening to the Seatrade Maritime Podcast, and we look forward to joining you on our next episode.